Welcome to URP 75. This week we are going to go over the basics of the global economy. The economy or economic concepts are central to understanding globalization, as globalization is primarily an economic phenomena. What are these concepts? Some of these are listed right here. Here you have the market. What is the market? We'll talk about that. Measures of income, gross domestic product, per capita income, household distribution, and poverty. Poverty can be measured several different ways. We will talk about that in the coming weeks. The different economic sectors that are listed here. The U.S., for example, is primarily a service-based country. We have agricultural, industrial, informal, etc., as well as the primary, secondary, and tertiary economic sectors. Another important concept is credit. Credit is absolutely essential to functioning in the modern world. Just think about how many different lines of credit you already have in your lives, and this may include a car loan, it may include a credit card, and as you get older, you'll get a mortgage for a home, and so on. Microcredit is a version of credit. It's just a smaller amount of credit, and it's primarily used in developing or poor countries to make loans to people who would not normally qualify for credit because of their income levels, because they are too poor or living in extreme poverty. Another very important concept is absolute and comparative advantage. Absolute and comparative advantage deal with the different types of advantages a country may have, and these are production advantages. For example, some countries may be better at producing cars, others may be better at producing wine. Absolute advantage was coined by Adam Smith and comparative by David Ricardo. And it's really comparative advantage that we care about, because comparative advantage is the cornerstone of globalization. Then we will talk about the Federal Reserve, and you have heard about the Federal Reserve, I imagine, because it is often in the news and in the context of raising rates or decreasing interest rates. Quantitative easing, this is a tool used by the Federal Reserve to basically stimulate or slow down the economy. There are different types of policies the government can engage in. Some are fiscal, some are monetary, and others are geared towards trade. Fiscal policies are basically deal with providing some kind of tax credit or tax benefit or penalty for engaging in certain behavior. For example, if the government gives you a tax deduction for buying a house, that's a fiscal policy. Monetary policies are primarily exercised by the Federal Reserve, and these are aimed at controlling the money supply. Other types of policies deal with the trade. You may have heard, our president has threatened to, for example, increase the tariff rates on imported goods. Tariffs are, of course, the taxes applied to these imported goods. That would be an example of trade policy. Securitization is also a related concept, and securitization basically deals with taking debt. What is debt? Mortgage debt, car loan debt, and bundling this debt up into larger instruments. So imagine you're an investor, you go out to buy a security which has some mortgage debt, which has some auto loan debt, and you buy this security. And why do you buy the security? Because each one of these different types of debt has an interest rate on which you collect interest. The average interest rate from these different types of debt that is lumped into your security and will be your average rate of return. And this is kind of a complicated concept. I just wanted to introduce the basic idea of a security at this point. We'll talk about economic institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Trade Organization. The World Bank and IMF and WTO came out of the Bretton Woods Agreement that was spearheaded by John Maynard Keynes. For those of you in economics, he's kind of an important figure, father of classical economics. And basically, these institutions were created with the intent that the world should never fall into the kind of depression again, to basically increase the boom cycles, boom meaning where the economy is expanding, and to reduce the number of months or of time that the economy is in a recession. And then there are development strategies. Structural adjustment is the policy that is most favored by the IMF. And this policy primarily deals with getting countries to engage in market-oriented reforms. So what are these reforms? Deregulation. Deregulation means letting businesses do what they want to do as opposed to having heavy government regulation. Cutting deficits, that means stop borrowing money. Reducing trade barriers, basically not throwing up high tariffs that prevent international trade from happening. So these kinds of policies collectively are known as structural adjustment. And then there's import substitution policies, which basically are policies that sometimes developing countries pursue to strengthen local industries. So imagine you are a country and you have an industry or a sort of a new industry that is trying to sell cars. Now, this industry is not very mature. It's not very competitive. If other car companies from the outside are allowed to come in and sell cars, it's very likely that this new industry that you are trying to develop in your country will not survive, right? So what do you do? In this case, what you do is you enact a series of policies that basically make it difficult, if not impossible, for foreign companies to come in. So the only industry that is left is the car industry trying to develop locally. Now, the disadvantage of this is that you may end up with a company that is local in your country that has a monopoly on car production. And so the quality of that car may not be as good as the cars that you would be importing. But since they have a monopoly, they don't really care. Here we have some important economic thinkers, and you can read about them: Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, John Maynard Keynes. I've mentioned some of these already: Joseph Schumpeter and Paul Krugman. And each one, has contributed pretty seminal, important ideas to our modern way of understanding the economy. I'll let you read these on your own. These are pretty self-evident. David Ricardo, Karl Marx, Paul Krugman. Okay, so why do we care about economics? Economics is a study of resource utilization and how to put those resources to the best possible use. What is best possible use? This is dictated by the market. Why do we care to do this? Because resources are inherently limited, and you will have multiple or alternative uses for resources. So you should really use those resources for those things for which society has the greatest value. So for example, you have wood or trees. What could those trees be used for? Well, you could cut down the trees and use the wood for paper. You could use the wood for building materials. You could use the wood to make boats. Lots of different uses. The demand for various products, whether it's paper, whether it's building materials, will determine what that wood is used for. Of course, another use for that tree is to actually leave it alone and use it for shade, not cut it down. Preserve the resource. Okay. All of these uses are dictated by the demand for shade or demand for wood materials, construction materials, the demand for boats, the demand for paper, and so on. Economics allows us to put these resources to their best possible use. There are different kinds of economies, and the two sort of bookends are a market-based economy, which is what we have, or more or less what we have, and a centrally controlled one. You think communism, where you have central planners that dictate how resources are allocated. This usually leads to inefficiency. Why? Because in capitalism, you have to consider prices, and how badly do you want a certain good will determine the price. And so people who produce goods respond to demand by either producing more of the good, which drives down prices, or producing the same amount or less, in which case prices go up. And supply and people who are consuming goods, those who demand goods and services, respond by either buying more of the product or buying less of the product in response to these prices. So in theory, at least, the idea is that the market reaches an equilibrium price between demand and supply, and you've seen these curves if you've taken an economics class, where this equilibrium price is sort of the best price for that bundle of goods or services. And what do we mean by best price? It means that the price is not set too high or not set too low. It's kind of right where it should be, given the quantity of goods supplied and the quantity of goods that are being demanded. This allows for efficiency and the optimal allocation of resources. In markets in economies which are characterized by capitalism, prices are not set by external actors like the state. And so demand and supply allows for a constant adjustment of prices, which makes the market more efficient. At least that's the theory. Here's another important economic concept. It's called opportunity cost. What is opportunity cost? Basically, opportunity cost is the path that you give up when you go down a particular path, or all the other paths that you give up when you go down a particular path. For example, in simple terms, the opportunity cost of you listening to this lecture is watching TV, because you could be watching TV or watching this lecture, or you could be outside, going out with your friends or doing something else. So the direct cost is not the only thing that we should be concerned about, but also the indirect cost. And the indirect cost is modeled by opportunity cost. So for example, again, using the analogy of the tree, we could have made paper with that tree, and to consider the use of that tree, the best possible use of that tree, we not only have to consider the value of that paper, but we also have to consider what we could have made if we had used some of that tree to make, let's say, building materials or a boat or something else like that. Opportunity cost is essential because it is central to the concept of comparative advantage. Basically, comparative advantage tells us that you should go or specialize in those things for which you have the least opportunity cost. Simply put, what this means is that you should specialize in those things for which you are best suited, which you can make most efficiently, or make those things that you are the best at making, because you will make so much of that product, and the money you make from that product, you can buy everything else. All right. Need, another important concept. Now, this is kind of a hard concept to understand. There's no such thing as a fixed need. And this is again kind of a hard concept to understand, because we sometimes think, well, we have a fixed need for food, and maybe that is one of the few things that we can say there's a fixed need for. You need about 1,800 to 2,000 calories a day, but other than that, the essentials, right, like food and water, there is no such thing as a fixed need. There's no fixed amount of house you need to consume, no fixed amount of cars, no fixed amount of clothes. These are largely driven by society, culture, preferences, and availability of these products, and so on. Okay, what is a market? A market is basically a place. It can be real, or it can be virtual, right? Amazon is a virtual market where people who sell stuff come together with people who buy stuff, and goods and services are exchanged for some kind of money. There's some assumptions of the market here. I've listed them that allow markets to be efficient. Large number of sellers and buyers. There's competition, and that means there's monopolies are discouraged, right? Monopolies where there's only one type of seller. Consumers have information about products and alternatives. There's a free flow of information, transparency in the market, and prices are allowed to rise and fall in response to market forces. In other words, prices are not held artificially at a certain level. Prices, I think we all know what prices are, but basically prices are you can think of them as a number attached to a particular good or service, and that number it indexes a currency, right? So in our case, it would be the dollar. But prices, in the abstract sense, help us determine how scarce resources are used. Because, for example, if we go and see, the price of a particular type of car is 10,000, another type of car is 12,000, we know 12,000 is more than 10,000. And that price helps us determine whether we want to consume that car, i.e. buy the car, or not buy the car. So it helps us guide our behavior. Profits. Well, profits are kind of a complicated concept as well. Profits deal with basically the difference between what a good is sold for and what it took to make the good. Now ask yourself, when thinking about profits, why would anybody pay more for a particular good if they knew exactly what it cost? For example, most of you have smartphones. If you figure out that your smartphone costs only $10 or $20 to make, would you be still willing to pay $500 for it? Right? Because the difference between what you're willing to pay and what it actually cost is actually the profit margin for the producer. Here we have an example of securitization. I'm going to zoom into this a little bit. What is securitization? Basically, securitization is the bundling of debt, as I mentioned earlier, into instruments that can be sold to investors. So here I give you sort of a visual depiction of that, right? You have different types of debt backed into a security, and it's sold to investors. Another important concept called economies of scale, and basically this is a complicated way of saying is that the bigger you go, the more efficiencies you can achieve, right? So size in this case includes or creates efficiencies. Market failure. When do markets not work? Markets often do not work. Right now we have sort of theoretically explained markets as this beautiful, wonderful thing that allows the lowest possible price to emerge, but there's market failure occurs all the time. When does it occur? When you have lack of information. An example of this is insider trading. When you have monopolies, when transaction costs are not considered. In other words, sometimes when you go and buy goods at a store, you don't consider the cost of driving to the store or the transportation cost of transporting that good to the store. If transaction costs are not fully considered, you may have some type of market failure. There's also free rider effects. For example, you may create a good like a park or national defense, or funding for schools, now which comes from property taxes. Now, not everybody pays property taxes, and yet some of these monies go to parks, national defense, and schools that everybody can use, though not everybody pays in. And this is called the free rider effect, using something for which you have not paid. And kind of probably the most important concept here is an externality. Externality is the impact on somebody or something that is not part of the market. Now think of it this way. You go to the market, you buy a good, you put the good in a plastic bag and you bring the plastic bag home, right? And then when you're done using the plastic bag or the plastic cup, you throw it away. Some of these plastic cups, bags, and so on go to the landfill. In many cases, they end up in the ocean. And then in the ocean, these plastic goods become, over time, they degrade. They become smaller. Fishes consume them, birds consume them. In fact, if you look at the North Pacific Gyre, you can see we have just tons of plastic debris floating there. So we are impacting all varieties of ocean life by consuming plastic, for example. However, we have not considered the cost of this ocean life or cleaning up the plastic or the environmental impact of using plastic. It is not factored into the price of the bag. Therefore, the externality here is the impact on things such as ocean life and the environment, which are outside of our immediate transaction. And that transaction is, should we use a plastic bag or plastic cup or not when purchasing and transporting the goods that we buy. Here I explain externalities again. Okay, liberalization. Liberalization basically deals with privatization. And it means you can have a centrally planned economy which is encouraged to privatize quickly. More liberalization here and foreign competition. Okay, now we come to absolute and comparative advantage. And as I mentioned, comparative advantage is the concept that we are a bit more interested in. What is comparative advantage? It deals with opportunity cost, and it deals with this idea that when one region can make a good or bundle of goods most efficiently, which has the least opportunity cost compared to all other goods. Regions should thus specialize in those goods for which they have a comparative advantage. At least that is what globalization theory tells us. Why? Well, why do this? Because let's say, for example, you can produce cars and you can produce paper. Now, let's say the opportunity cost for cars is less than paper, okay, for whatever reason. What comparative advantage theory tells us is that you should actually focus all of your resources on making cars. Don't make cars and papers, both, but make just cars, because you'll make so many more cars comparatively that you can sell those cars for a price, and you can buy all the paper you want. In fact, you can buy more paper than you would have if you made the paper yourself. Here's an example of comparative advantage. I'll let you work through this example to understand it. Another important concept is inflation and deflation. What is inflation? It's the tendency of prices of goods and services to rise with time. Deflation is the exact opposite. The Federal Reserve is really concerned about inflation, but it is even more concerned about deflation. Deflation very rarely happens, though countries like Japan are in what might be termed loosely stagflation. If deflation occurs, the economy is in a tailspin, and that's very, very bad. It's contracting the economy. Inflation, on the other hand, a nominal, a small amount of inflation is a sign of a healthy economy. When you have a lot of inflation, right, 8 to 10%, for example, our inflation in the U.S. is very low. It's somewhere between 1 and 2% in the last few years, pretty low. But if you have 8 to 10% or higher, that means the cost of goods and services are increasing much faster than the population can afford. Okay, our financial systems. You've all heard of banks, right? What do banks do? Basically, they are a repository, a warehouse of money. You go there and deposit money, and then banks loan out that money to stimulate the economy and then make a little bit of money along the way. Banks provide credit and increase the money supply through something called the fractional reserve banking. Okay, fractional. What is fractional reserve banking? Basically, the idea is that for every dollar that is held by the bank that you deposited, the bank can loan out some multiple of that, and maybe 2 or 3 or 4 times. Think about this. The bank is lending out 3 to 4 times of the actual deposits in the bank. Why is this important? Because this increases the amount of theoretical money that is available to buy goods and services. This stimulates the economy. Who sets the ratios, right, for the bank that they can lend out at? It's the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve exercises the nation's monetary policy by primarily 3 main ways. It sets the discount rate. What is the discount rate? Which is the rate at which banks lend to each other, or the rate at which the Fed lends to the bank. Now, you never want to go to the Fed to borrow money from the Federal Reserve, because that means your bank is in trouble. You can go to the Federal Reserve to borrow money if you're a bank, but banks never do. They borrow from each other using the federal funds rate, which is indexed or tied to the discount rate. Right? This is the rate at which the Fed lends to member banks. Then you have fractional reserve banking, which is the ratio of money that the banks must keep on deposit at the Federal Reserve. So this basically limits the amount that can be lent out. And then we have open market transactions, which is a way for the Fed to basically buy bonds from banks or sell bonds to bank. Why would the Federal Reserve do this? For example, think of it this way. If Wells Fargo, for example, has $1 million in bonds, those bonds represent $1 million in cash, but Wells Fargo cannot loan out bonds. It must loan out cash. So in order for the Wells Fargo to convert bonds to cash, it has to sell the bonds to somebody. It can sell the bonds to a lot of different people, but often the Federal Reserve, in order to free up cash, will go to different banks and buy up bonds, thereby giving the banks cash, which they can again lend out. This is called an open market transaction. This is a chart of the Federal Reserve's earning and expenses. And what you notice here, the biggest amount is transferred back to the Treasury. Okay, back to the Treasury. That means the Federal Reserve actually makes money for the Treasury. And this is kind of an interesting thing because when the Federal Reserve is buying bonds, in this case, for example, it buys bonds from Wells Fargo, it actually does not use cash. Money just magically shows up on the balance sheets of the banks. Now, once the Federal Reserve holds these bonds, the banks have to pay Federal Reserve interest rate on the bonds. That interest rate generates revenue for the Federal Reserve, which it transfers back to the Treasury. So in this way, the Federal Reserve is actually creating money out of thin air. Interesting and a little bit scary, right? Here is a chart of show me the money. It's quite confusing, right? Issues credit like money to the banks. Banks sell in bonds. Profits go to the treasury. Member banks also take in deposits from the publics. They make loans back to the public. They also use cash to make investments. This goes back to the member banks, right? And then the deposits, which you put in the member banks, are insured by the U.S. government through the FDIC. The government sells bonds to the member banks, which again sells bonds back to the Fed, right? And so all of this goes on and on and on, and increasing the amount of money and goods and services in the economy. We talked about monetary policy earlier. This is the policies exercised by the Federal Reserve to increase or decrease the money supply. Fiscal policy is everything else that is not a monetary policy. Tax cuts, tax credits, and so on. Quantitative easing is used when traditional monetary policy is ineffective. What is traditional monetary policy? Again, it is discount rate, fractional reserve banking, and open market transactions. When this is not enough, we use quantitative easing. What is that? We buy other financial assets from lending institutions. In other words, when you go to the bank and you get a car loan, now typically the Federal Reserve does not buy car loans, but in this case, and quantitative easing is also known as QE1, QE2, QE3, right? You've heard these phrases. The Federal Reserve will buy auto loans from the banks. What is the impact of this? Well, when they buy auto loans, all of a sudden the debt is now held at the Federal Reserve and the bank has money. Before it had a promissory note from you saying, hey, Mr. Bank, I will pay you for my auto every month. Instead of that, now it has cash and the debt is actually held by the Federal Reserve. See, this also increases liquidity. Liquidity is another way of saying the amount of cash or money that is in the system. We talked about IMF, World Bank, WTO, and why they were created, but basically they were created to, again, forestall or delay recessionary and depressionary economic cycles. World Bank tends to make loans for very large infrastructure type projects, think dams, transportation. IMF lends money, basically, IMF is like the Federal Reserve of the world. It lends money when countries are failing. They can no longer service their debt, for example, like Greece. And WTO, which is a successor to the General Agreement for Tariffs and Trades, sets the rules of trade between nations. When countries get pissed off at each other, about the rules of trade, they go to the WTO. Membership in WTO is absolutely essential for the global markets because WTO is the arbiter or the deciding authority of the rules of trade between nations. I will let you read these on your own. Basic measures of income, gross domestic product, per capita income, how they're defined and what they mean. Right? GDP is how much money a country makes per capita. Divide the GDP by population, family income, household income. Purchasing power parity is an important concept. It deals with the adjustments made to a particular value of a particular currency to account for purchasing power. So, for example, the exchange rate of the dollar and the yuan, which is the Chinese currency, maybe let's say, and this is just for argument's sake, $1 equals, let's say, 3 to 4 yuan. But that does not capture the value of the yuan completely because the yuan goes a lot farther in China because the cost of goods and services is cheaper in China than it is in the United States. So you can make purchasing power parity adjustments to the currencies to account for this purchasing power because money goes a lot farther in poorer or developing countries. We'll talk about poverty more specifically, but there's two types: absolute, which is measured in terms of the number of people making less than $1 a day. Today, that threshold is $1.95 a day, or relative poverty, which is what characterizes poverty in the U.S. and other rich or developed countries. Okay, here we are ending with the role of the government and the legal system. Why is government important? Because it sets the framework, the system of laws and regulations that govern the economy. So in the most important sense, the government secures individual rights. It protects private property. This is in a capitalist democratic government, and it allows, and this is arguably the most important function of the government in our society, smooth functioning of markets. Why do we care about democracy? Because democracy allows markets to thrive. Imagine a system where you did not have the capacity to exercise your free will. You could not buy what you wanted and not buy what you wanted. If you could not do that, markets would not function. Capitalism would not function. Democracy is important because not just because people are intrinsically free, but also because democracy is essential to the smooth functioning of markets. Legal system, of course, democracy does not have any teeth, feet, if it is not followed up by a strong legal system. And again, legal systems are there to protect individual rights, but also perhaps more importantly, enforce contracts, at least in a capitalist system. Imagine if your contracts were not enforceable, people would rip each other off all the time. And here we come to an end of our slides. Thank you.